The United States cared greatly about the Gulf, in large part because the Soviet Union was adjacent to the Gulf. What's amazing about the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and most of you are all too young or too young to appreciate this, is the Soviet Union was a country that was physically located in Europe, the #1 area of the world for the United States outside of the Western Hemisphere, from a strategic perspective. It was physically located in Northeast Asia, the second most important area of the world for the United States, and it was adjacent to Iran. After the 1979 revolution in Iran, and I'll talk more about this in a second, we worried greatly about the Soviets invading Iran. So the three areas of the world that we cared the most about, we had the Soviets either physically there or right next door. So going back to 1945, we were worried about the Gulf and we were worried about the Soviets. The question is, how did we deal with the problem? From 45 to 68, we depended on the British. The Americans had no military forces of any significance in the region, nor did we build military forces to fight and die in the region. It was an area of great strategic importance, you understand that? But in a very important way, we passed the buck. We relied on the British, who had a rich history in the region, as you all know, to do the heavy lifting for us. In 1968, the British said they were too tired and too weak to continue policing the Gulf and to continue policing other areas east of Suez, and they were pulling back. So we were in a quandary as to what to do. What we did from 1968 to 1979 is we relied heavily on the Shah. We relied heavily on Iran and to a lesser extent on Saudi Arabia to keep peace and order in the Persian Gulf. Remember, we put the Shah back in power in 1953. 1953, put the Shah back in power, and we put back in power for a good reason. We wanted a friendly leader in Iran so that if a rainy day came along, we could rely on the Shah. And that's what happened in 1968, after the British reduced their influence. From 1968 to 1979, we relied on Iran. In 1979, there was the revolution in Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. U.S.-Iranian relations went down the toilet bowl, and the United States, for the first time, had to develop its own military forces to fight in the Gulf. And we developed the famous Rapid Deployment Force, the RDF. It was an offshore capability. It was an over-the-horizon capability. It was a military force that was stationed outside of the region and designed to be able to move quickly into the region if need be. We were an offshore balancer from 1979 to 1991. Even though we had this powerful military force that could be used in the region, we went to great lengths not to keep it in the region. Then in 1991, on August 2nd, 1991, you all know what happened. Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait. George H.W. Bush was the president. He said that was unacceptable, and we decided to go to war against Saddam Hussein to throw him, or to throw his military, out of Kuwait. We did that, of course, in January, February 1991. Saddam, again, invaded Kuwait August 2nd, 1990, and then we fought the war, First Gulf War, January, February 1991. The first elements that went into Saudi Arabia to fight that war were the RDF forces. And then we brought other forces from Germany in as well, and we won a great victory. We threw Saddam's forces out of Kuwait. and Kuwait regained its independence, and Iraq indeed suffered a humiliating defeat. Then, under the Clinton administration, we made a fatal mistake. Instead of winning the war and then moving back offshore, we decided to stay in the region physically. We decided to stay there, and we decided that instead of letting Iran and Iraq check each other, we would take it upon ourselves to check both countries. It was called dual containment. Let me explain to you what happened there. You all remember the Iraq-Iran War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988. Iran versus Iraq. The United States actually assisted Iraq in that war. You've seen the famous pictures of Donald Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein standing next to each other, smiling. What was going on there is that we were in the period 79 to 91, that's when the 80 to 88 war took place, offshore balancing, we were playing the local powers off against each other. We were letting Iran and Iraq check each other, which is exactly what we should have done. We abandoned that policy in the first year of the Clinton administration, and we decided instead that we would keep forces in the region, no more over-the-horizon capability, and that we would check both Iran and Iraq ourselves. That's dual containment. Now, what happens here is we get more and more involved. We've got forces in Saudi Arabia, and this is one of the principal motivating factors behind Osama bin Laden's attack on the United States on September 11th. Osama bin Laden was greatly bothered by the fact that the American military was physically located in Saudi Arabia. Right? So what happens in 2001 is the United States gets whacked. And what does the United States decide to do as a consequence? George W. Bush is now the president. We decide to abandon dual containment and adopt an offensively oriented policy of regime change. And that, of course, is what I'm going to talk about today, because I'm going to talk about U.S. Middle East policy from 2001 forward. I'm going to get to that in a second. The policy from 2001 forward is regime change. But what I've done here, what I've tried to do, is I want to walk you through the evolution of U.S. policy towards the Gulf since 1945, because it's important that you understand the context. You understand where regime change came from. The story that I'm telling you here about American Middle East policy from 45 forward is that from 45 to 79, the United States basically relied on others to do the heavy lifting in the Gulf. We did not have the military capability to do much of anything in the Gulf from 45 to 79. We relied first on the British, then mainly on the Iranians, and lesser on the Saudis. Then, when it became clear that we were going to have to build military forces to deal with the region, we developed an over-the-horizon capability. We acted as an offshore balancer. We did not go onshore because we understood we'd get into trouble if we did. Okay? That all ended in 91. Actually, in 92. That all ended. And what happened is we moved to dual containment. But it's containment, which is much more defensive in nature than regime change, which is offensive in nature. Then comes September 11th. We adopt regime change under George W. Bush, which is continued under President Obama. No meaningful difference between George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Their foreign policies in the region are very similar.